Hey everyone, welcome to week 3, and you can see the title of this week's lecture is Fragmented Federalism, which comes from one of the articles that I'm having you read. So let me get right into that. At the outset, let me say that I am trying to keep this discussion or this lecture brief for a couple of reasons. One is there's no discussion this week, but I do assign you a journal that's due at the end of this week. That's the first of several of those that we have during the term. First of 3, I think, that we have during the term. So there is a significant amount of reading. You note I gave you some readings from the texts and a couple of articles to read, which I think are pertinent. So I really want you to spend most of your time doing that reading and then combining it with your thoughts for this journal. But what I'm introducing this week is several policy areas, a few policy areas that have intergovernmental relations or intergovernmental management implications. So IGR, IGM implications in all these policy areas. And kind of the last thing we want to cover with regard to that is asking this question: what are the interactions between federalism as a concept and partisanship or party politics, if you will? Because there are interactions between federalism and partisanship. And I only state that because we often, I think, have this view that the two primary concepts of the Constitution, which are federalism and separation of powers, right? Which talk about how federalism talks about the relationship between the national government and states, and partisanship talks, or separation of powers talks about the relationship between the branches of the federal government. We get the idea that those are sort of valueless concepts. But really, I think it's fair to say that both these concepts were designed within an environment of partisanship. Now, the partisans in 1787 weren't called Republicans and Democrats, but they had other interests, other partisan and regional interests, if you will. And so I think there's always been a connection between federalism and partisanship, and we're going to get into that a little bit more in this lecture. So let's talk about models of intergovernmental relations, or models of federalism, if you will. So there was this scholar named D.L. Wright who spent his entire career talking about models of intergovernmental relations and trying to come to grips with how do the relationships between basically the 3 major levels of government work. And so here's one of the famous ones where he has these interlocking circles. And so you can see the first one there is called the coordinate model. So I define this by the relationship and the model. So I call the first one the coordinate independent model. The second one is the overlapping model. I call this one the overlapping-interdependent model. And the third one is inclusive, and I call this one the inclusive dependent model. So you can see just by the way the circles interlock that the relationships are different. So let me describe those a little bit. So in this coordinate independent model, that's one with 2 circles. There was one circle that had the national government, and then another circle that had a state government with the local government inside that. And so the idea of this is that there is a sharp and distinct boundary between the national government and the state governments, and then the local governments are dependent on the states. And so something we're going to talk about a little later in the course is this thing called Dillon's Rule, which was a legal ruling in the 1800s, which defined the relationship between cities and states. And Dillon's Rule says basically that there really is no common law right of self-government for cities, that local entities are creatures of the states. That's what Judge Dillon said. And that local entities exercise only those powers granted by the state. And they operate at the will of the legislature. So the idea is that a state can always write laws that supersede the laws of its subordinate cities, but not so between the national government and the state government in this model. So there is a sharp distinction of the term sovereignty, if you will, between the state and the national government in this model. And then there's the overlapping interdependent model. That's the one in the middle that looked like a three-circle Venn diagram. So what that's telling you is that each area of government has areas of interest or concern, but there is substantial overlap between all three of them. So all the national, state, and local units, have areas where they coordinate and are interdependent with each other. And what makes that different than the first model is really the idea that cities also coordinate with the national government. And indeed, we can see that happening in a lot of areas where, there is a relationship between the national governments and city governments, if you will, that often bypasses the state governments. And you can probably think of some. In the modern era, post 9/11, there was a lot of federal aid to local emergency departments, local police and fire departments, whereby excess military equipment and other equipment, such as anti-terrorism equipment, was distributed directly to cities, really sometimes without state interaction. Think of housing authorities, like the Omaha Housing Authority. There's really not a state connection. The money is flowing directly from HUD to the various housing authorities. So there is this interlocking circle idea. And the thing that D.L. Wright was trying to say was that model involves a lot of bargaining between units. It becomes necessitated. And the third one was the one that looked like hierarchical circles. And indeed, that's what this model is trying to imply, that there is a hierarchy of government with the national government at the top. And so what that model, if you go along with that model, what it's saying is that states end up being treated as administrative districts in a larger governmental scheme. And so there are nations really that this is built into the Constitution. So if you go to South Korea, this is the way the government works in South Korea. There are provinces or administrative provinces, if you will, but they are fully dependent on the national government, and cities are dependent on those provinces. So basically, it is a hierarchy where the higher level grants authority to the lower level government. And so localities are subject to the state is subject to the national government. So those are the three models that D.L. Wright described. And so this kind of led to these cake diagrams, right? And so one of the articles makes fun of all the cake diagrams. Here's just a couple of them, right? So the classic is the layer cake federalism, right? That's early federalism or dual federalism in the United States, where each sector of government, federal government, state governments, county governments, if you will, municipal governments had layers that they were responsible for. And so it'd be just like baking a cake. You could have a layer of chocolate, a layer of vanilla, a layer of lemon, or whatever. The layers, you could eat them all together, but you don't have to, and they don't really run into each other. Opposed to a marble cake, where you are mixing the ingredients, but you actually make it in such a way that you can still clearly see where the vanilla ends and the chocolate begins. But enough of those, cake models, because like any kind of analogy, they don't really tell the whole story. So this is impossible to read almost, and I only put this here for a reason, and that is to get you to pause the lecture just for a second and pull out your Stenberg and Hamilton text and turn to page 16, and that's this chart right here. So we're going to refer to that. So go ahead and pull that out. So, okay, so if you're looking at that table 2.1 in the Stenberg and Hamilton text, that's the article by J.E. Benton. Table 2.1. So what Benton is trying to do, based on D.O. Wright's writing, Benton has added a little bit at the end, and I'll get to that. But based on D.O. Wright's work, here's what Benton is trying to say. That the relationship between the national government and states in particular is like any other kind of relationship. And this is a handy way for me to think about this. If you think about a relationship between spouses, or a relationship between good friends, or a relationship between business partners, what we're talking about essentially is a relationship of co-equal persons, right? So in any relationship of co-equal persons, there are some elements that we have to come to terms with. So I'll look at table 2.1 and skip the column. The first column says phase descriptor, right? That's kind of the one word descriptor of what's being talked about. But go to the second column. So there's 6 columns there, but go to the second column. So there's always problems to solve in any one of these relationships, right? There's often sort of an underlying problem that might underlie all of the other problems, but in these relationships, there's always sort of a problem or an issue, and it doesn't have to be, a big problem. It could be just sort of the underlying terms of the relationship that have to be worked out. So, money is always sort of an issue in relationships between spouses, right? And it doesn't mean it's a problem that blows up, but it's an issue that's always there. And so then the next column, there's always perceptions on the part of each party that could lead to different perspectives on how to solve the problem, right? So one spouse likes to spend money, one spouse likes to save money. So now they have different perceptions, and so that's going to exacerbate your problem, right? Well, so there's the next column. It says IGR mechanisms, but there's always available mechanisms for dealing with problems in any of these relationships, right? A discussion, you could hug it out, you could compromise, you could split responsibilities. You might decide to end the partnership, right? Whether you're talking about business partners, friends, or even spouses, right? There's legal and social ways to do that. And then we always have metaphors to describe relationships, right? This is a blissful relationship. This is an effective partnership. This is a profitable partnership. This is fulfilling. This is a match made in heaven. This is hell on earth, right? So people say stuff like this about relationships, but what they're really talking about, what are they really talking about? They're given a metaphor to describe the way in which the problems have been solved. That's really what they're talking about, isn't it? They're talking about how this partnership has chosen to solve problems. And then there is some time boundness of this relationship, and that's the last column in table 2.1. So table 2.1 is trying to put a historical spin on it, but the fact of the matter is all these kinds of relationships that I describe up there also have some time boundness, right? And so certainly a relationship between spouses, if they stay married for years or decades, that relationship and the way they solve problems is probably going to change. So right now, here we are in the back on table 2.1, right? So I'm going to talk about this slide, but I'm actually going to refer you to the reading. That's why I want you to have the textbook out. So first, go to the very first row, which is the phase descriptor is conflict. So this is talking about dual federalism in a sense, right? So look at the last column. It says the approximate climax period was the 19th century through the 1930s. So really from the beginning of the Republic, 1790-ish, through the 1930s, although I might take a little bit of issue with that. So what was the problem? The problem was actually defining boundaries and figuring out the proper spheres of influence, right? So we think that the Constitution was written in such a way that definitively described the relationship between the states and the national government. Well, But if that were the case, then there wouldn't have been so many court proceedings where the states tried to sue the national government, and where the Congress tried to implement actions that were vetoed by presidents and that ended up in the Supreme Court, um, whereby this relationship was trying to find itself. So the perception is really important. This idea of antagonism and adversarial relationships between the states and the cities is really important, right? And this is why last week I said that the Civil War, most bloody war in U.S. history, more men killed in the Civil War than in the two world wars, Korea and Vietnam combined. If you think of the number of deaths in the Civil War, that would be a war today of about 6.5 million Americans being killed. 6.5 million, about 2% of the population. So about 2% of the population was killed in the Civil War. It was a bloody conflict. But from another standpoint, as I said last week, it was actually the end of this period of figuring out which government was supreme, the state or the national government. Because among other things, even though the Civil War really was about slavery, the southern states asserted they had a right to withdraw from the Union, and Lincoln disagreed with that, and the Republicans in the North disagreed with that. So that really was the culmination of that period, in a sense. And I talked about last week in the lecture how after the Civil War, the national government began injecting itself more into the economy and into states, right, with the acts I described. And you can think later in the 1800s and the early 1900s with the antitrust regulation that came during the Teddy Roosevelt administration, and the national park system, which wasn't just setting aside land for parks, it was actually intervening in the use of land by states. So really, in one sense, the national government was intervening more and more in what the states might have thought of as their prerogatives. So let's move on to this idea of cooperative federalism. That's in the second row, right? And I'm not going to go through all these, so you can be thankful for that. But cooperative federalism really is brought about by economic distress. And one of the texts talks about the idea that states had already begun to create some welfare programs, right? Mothers' pensions, old age pensions. These were actually co-opted into the Social Security system in the 1930s. So it is not as if the Franklin Roosevelt administration invented Social Security. It had been around in European nations, and in fact, it had been around in states. It is that the federal government basically subsumed all of these previous programs into a large federal program. And so we started to see cooperation and collaboration in those kinds of programs, because if you recall what Social Security did, it wasn't just old age insurance, which is what we all get at 67 years old now, or close to somewhere between 65 and 67, but it also included unemployment insurance, right? It included what was called Aid for Dependent Children, which became TANF several decades later. And so it was a cooperative program, federal dollars often administered at state level. Okay, so the next thing I want you to notice about this whole chart that's interesting is the mechanism. So that is just the fourth column. So the column that says IGR mechanisms. So go down a little bit. We talked about this, the conflict era, where statutes and courts and regulations were really the devices. But now go down at about the 1940s, say post-World War II era, where grants kind of became the device of exercising federalism, right? And so what we see is kind of an evolution of grants, right? From categorical grants, that is grants directed at a certain kind of category of policy, uh, to project grants, to consolidated grants, and now we have block grants. So grants themselves have kind of become the device for the relationship between the federal government and the state governments. So here's the fourth thing I want you to notice about this relationship between the national government and the states. I want you to go down to the last two areas, the last two rows on page 16, where it says calculative federalism and contractive federalism. Go to the second column where it says the main problem. And under calculative, it says accountability and bankruptcy, and under contractive, it says borrowing and balanced budget. So look at the years over on the right-hand column, the far right column. It says 1970s to 1980s in the first case, and then 1980s to 1990s in the second case. So here's what Congress was worrying about in the 1970s and 1980s. Post-Vietnam, there was an expectation that the United States extricated itself from Vietnam, and so therefore there would be freeing up of some money, right? Some kind of peace dividend. Well, in fact, that didn't really happen. It didn't happen for a couple of reasons. One is that some of the social programs created in the 1960s were growing. And the second reason is that while the military did shrink, the military also became an all-volunteer force, and didn't really shrink that much because the Cold War was still going on, and so the military became more expensive as well, or almost as expensive as it was in Vietnam. So we didn't see this great freeing up of money, and we started to worry about how we could balance the federal budget. Well, we haven't balanced the federal budget for very many years, since the late 1960s. But in the 1980s specifically, and the 1990s, trying to achieve a balanced budget was a great bipartisan concern. It was, in fact, a bipartisan concern. And so what happened was that the amount of money from the federal government to the states was slowing a bit. And so this became of great concern, right? The last thing I want to take you to is flip the page over to page 17, and this phase descriptor, this is the last one that was added to D.O. Wright's description, was this idea of kaleidoscope federalism, right? Kaleidoscope federalism. So the main problems are, what are the boundaries between the states and the national government? We have experienced some economic decline, right? We still have fiscal woes. We have a larger deficit now than we've ever had. We have a larger debt now than we've ever had. It's not going to shrink. We have a globalization and not the least of globalization is the globalization of the way money flows between nations. And we have an aging population, the baby boomers in this country and other countries. That age cohort is growing, right? And so we know that the Social Security program set up in the 1930s as under an insurance kind of scheme doesn't really pay for itself. And so the trust fund itself is going to become insolvent. So how do we deal with that? While at the same time trying to continue to have federal programs mandated to the state level and states pushing back at the federal government. And so we end up with this situation where the metaphor has been called by some scholars fend for yourself federalism. And so that's what some of the readings talk about, this idea that we have a patchwork of programs which don't necessarily have resemblance state to state. So take some time and look at that chart 2.1 and think about how that affects programs that you have in mind. So one of the readings, I guess from the Conlon and Posner text, is this Conlon reading where, he gives the model of geographic or geologic, I guess, federalism, right? We can compare the relationship to what we know about rock formation, sedimentary or metamorphic or igneous rocks, right? So sedimentary, that's an interesting way to think about it, because that's a way of thinking about policy as well, that policy doesn't really go away to be replaced by another policy. We just simply layer new policy on top of old policy, and then newer policy on top of that policy, until it settles into this rock, if you will, with all these layers. And so we can see that really in the way education policy has grown, right? It is primarily funded by states and localities. However, there are all kinds of federal requirements on there that have layered over time. And then we have metamorphic. That is changes. A metamorphic rock is changed due to pressure or heat. And so we can see that things have changed due to other forces. So environmental law has morphed from local and state concern to a national concern. And even environmental law itself has morphed in, from clean air and clean water to really, and that's still there, but also to concerns about climate change. And then we have igneous rock, if you will, which is caused by seismic events or volcanoes, right? So there have been these great seismic events in the history of the United States, like the Civil War, the New Deal, and the Great Society programs, which have completely changed the nature of the relationship between the national government and the state governments. So the last couple slides, what I want to do is talk about from this Goltzhauser and Rose article, that's the 2017 State of Federalism article, talk about these several policy areas that that attempt to look at the relationship of party politics or partisanship to federalism. So just real briefly, so healthcare. So where we're at right now with healthcare, right? Right now we have a ruling called Texas versus the United States, which the judge in that case said that the Affordable Care Act was unconstitutional. Well, that's going to go to the Supreme Court, right? Because we have a previous act, Federation of Independent Business versus Sebelius, Kathleen Sebelius, who was Secretary of HHS, which changed the original Affordable Care Act and upheld the individual mandate. So we had one administration, the previous administration, pushed to have the Affordable Care Act passed. The current administration wants to get rid of it. What's gonna happen in the end? We're kind of in this never state between not fully repealed and repealed, right? And that does affect the way people can get health care in various states. Immigration. So immigration has been ruled to be a national prerogative by Supreme Court decisions. But what do we have going on in states? We have a couple of things going on in states. We have these so-called sanctuary cities where the cities by ordinance have said we aren't going to enforce federal immigration laws. On the other side of the spectrum, we have states, Arizona has done this, and other states which have passed more restrictive immigration laws. We have had state lawsuits regarding the so-called travel ban by President Trump, which, okay, so his third or fourth go-round with the travel ban was ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court. And so that one was essentially settled, but we had this idea of states bringing suit against the federal government, which was also happening with the Affordable Care Act. We have marijuana, which is an interesting area because we have more and more states legalizing medicinal marijuana or recreational marijuana. But we have a renewed emphasis under the current administration to enforce federal marijuana laws regarding that substance. However, states continue to legalize it. So what's going to be the end state of that with regards to federalism? So we have education. The Every Student Succeeds Act was under the Obama administration to kind of update or try to improve the No Child Left Behind act, but we have states continuing to actually strive to get waivers to both of those ideas. And we have continuing changes of emphasis on the part of the United States Education Department. Couple other issues, energy and the environment, right? So the Trump administration reversed what the Obama administration said about the Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines. Trouble is, whether that was under the purview of the federal government in the first place was open to question, because in our own state of Nebraska, Nebraska said under the Public Service Commission that Keystone couldn't build its pipeline through Nebraska. That's still a struggle. We have the beginnings of the reversal of the Clean Power Plan, which was a regulatory attempt by the Obama administration to rely less on coal and to make the emissions of power plants cleaner. But the Trump administration has said no. However, we have states that say, no, we're going to continue to abide. And then we have a mixed message on renewables, right? So what kind of renewables should be supported by the national government? States have their own policy on renewables. In Nebraska has not been as advanced with wind power as, say, Iowa. So there are differences between states on these policies. There's other issues, right? So will states change marriage laws to limit same-sex marriage? I don't know. Will states change laws on abortion for an eventual Supreme Court versus Wade redo? Roe versus Wade redo, I should say. The state of Alabama and the state of Missouri have. And finally, how will states react to changes in trade? The Trump administration has been advocating tariffs. States like Nebraska, even with Republican governors, have said we really need international trade. So there's areas of dispute, and the point is that partisanship and federalism are interacting with each other. So the question is federalism fragmented? I'm not going to talk about all the words on this slide. I think I've talked enough about this, but you can think through what I say on this slide. The question is, how do partisanship and federalism interact with each other in terms of policy? So that leads me up to the week 3 journal. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to write a journal, and you can use as many words as you want, really. So to write on this. Here's what I want you to really basically do is choose 1 or 2 policy areas as examples, case examples, if you will, to answer these questions. And the questions are there, 4 questions. Is federalism working as it's designed? Second, does federalism include built-in obstacles that prevent smooth functioning? Third, is federalism as we know it today healthy? And fourth, in the administration or implementation of the policy areas you select, does federalism help or hinder administrative effectiveness? So I said I wanted to keep this lecture to 20 minutes. I wasn't able to do that. It's about 34. But at any rate, I am looking forward to your journals this week. Thank you.